when we forgot how to observe things. You know, there's a there's a moment in every long journey where you realize something important, and it's not all about progress or moving forward. Some progress comes from noticing what was left behind. Modern life is very good at reacting. We respond quickly. We measure aggressively. We intervene forcefully. But what we've lost, often without realizing it, is the habit of observation. Now, quiet observation, patient observation, unhurried observation is attention to the observation, and it helps become aware. Now, earlier generations didn't have the tools we have today, all the resources. They didn't have advanced imaging. They didn't have consistent testing. They didn't have instant answers, but they had something we struggle to maintain now. They watched, they paid attention, they noticed patterns, they lived close enough to life to observe unfolding, the unraveling of life, the the unfolding of the realistic things, the scenes of life. Now, this episode is not about rejecting modern knowledge at all. It's about recognizing a missing layer, because before intervention comes it comes understanding, and before understanding comes observation. Without observation, even the most advanced tools in this world can be misused. In modern life, we often confuse information with wisdom. We have more data nowadays than any generation before us, more metrics, more measurements, more opinions, and yet many people feel less grounded, more anxious, more reactive. That's not failure of technology. It's the it's the loss of overall context. Now, observation requires something modern life rarely allows. It's stillness, not inactivity, not passivity, but presence. The willingness to notice what's happening without immediately trying to change it. Now, earlier thinkers understood this. They understood this instinctively. They watched seasons. They observed habits. They paid attention to rhythms, sleep, work, rest, appetite, energy. They didn't separate life into isolated systems. They saw it as integrated body, mind, environment, time. Body, mind, and spirit. It was all together. When we lose the habit of observation, we become dependent on external signals to tell us what's wrong. A test, a reading, a diagnosis, another person to tell us. Those things can be helpful, and sure, there's times when it's appropriate to seek the knowledge, but they're not substitutes for awareness. They are confirmations, not foundations. Now, one of the quiet problems of modern life that I see is that we are trained to outsource awareness. We wait for alerts, we wait for numbers, we wait for something to cross a threshold. By the time it does, the story has usually just been unfolding for years and years. Now, observation comes down to this. Observation, it doesn't prevent every single problem. No way. But it shortens the distance between cause and awareness. It allows us to notice a drift before we have the ultimate collapse, imbalance before failure, tension before rupture. That alone changes the outcomes. And that alone can mean the difference between life and death. Now, in earlier times, people lived closer to consequences. When habits changed, effects were felt. When rhythms were ignored, discomfort followed. When environments shifted, bodies responded. There was less buffer, but more feedback. Modern life has more buffer, but less feedback. Now, that buffer that we're talking about can be very dangerous. It allows unhealthy patterns to persist unnoticed for years and years, for long periods of time. It delays the signals. It creates the illusion that everything is fine until it isn't fine anymore. Now, this is why so many modern problems feel sudden. They're not sudden really. They're delayed awareness, delayed attention, delayed correction. And this is what we've all been, in previous episodes, we've been talking about this, discussing this delay of the buffer, delay of attention, delay of correction. Now, observation here that we're discussing isn't dramatic. It doesn't trend. It doesn't sell. It doesn't promise quick results, but it builds understanding quietly and reliably, like building blocks, build one on the other. Now, in this series, I've been moving and evolving toward this idea without naming it just straight outright. Foundations, patterns, margin, awareness, responsibility, all of these point toward the same skill, learning how to observe again. Not as spectators of life, but as participants in life, in our own lives, not obsessively, not fearfully, but attentively. Now, in the next part of this episode, we're going to start creeping into and evolving, exploring how older thinkers, how they approached observation, not as a philosophy, but as a way of living, how they learned by watching nature, how they trusted rhythm, how simplicity sharpened awareness rather than limiting it. This isn't about going backwards. It's about restoring something essential. Now, we have to just keep trying to get back as these episodes continue, as we start growing. We are evolving to gain more and more understanding of awareness of ourselves. Now, we see these things, when we move gently into nature, rhythm and the early thinkers setting the stage for Thoreau, Emerson, and the 19th century mindset without forcing a big transition. And, these people was back to the basic fundamentals because they had no choice. Now, I want you to think about, the times when, if you do remember, not having internet, not having all this technology at our hand. But, it's so interesting to see what we have before us, but how we are buried up in all this technology and how we get lost and how we're not aware. We should be more aware. But it, in many ways, it drives us further away, further deeper into unawareness. And that's what we need to fight. And the only way we can fight that is through observation. Now, there is a moment in every long journey where you realize something important. Not all progress is forward. Some progress comes from noticing what was left behind. But, modern life is very, very good at reacting. We respond quickly. We intervene fast. We measure things aggressively. We put calculations on it. We look for quick fixes, updates, and adjustments. But what we've quietly lost, often without realizing, is the habit of observation. Now, quiet observation, patient observation, unhurried attention. Now, earlier generations didn't have the tools we have today. They simply just didn't, and we take that, we take a lot of the things we had for granted. Think about how different life was when the day itself was a teacher, when sunrise mattered, when weather mattered, when hunger, fatigue, and rest were felt clearly. Those conditions sharpened the awareness. They were observations made, and through those observations you were aware. Now, when everything is mediated through systems, awareness dulls. When comfort is consistent, signals blur. That doesn't make modern life wrong. It makes observation just more necessary. Now, we have to look at this and we have to say, observation, it isn't mystical, it's practical. It means noticing how you sleep, how you wake, how you respond to stress, how your body feels before problems escalate. It means noticing these patterns over time. Now, as we know, older thinkers didn't separate observation from living. They didn't treat awareness as a technique. It was simply how they moved through the world they lived in. Now, as we talk and as this series continues, we're evolving. The series evolves. We'll begin spending more time with those thinkers and examine what it was that motivate them. Not as authorities, not as idols, but as observers. People who asked simple questions and paid attention to what life showed them. Now, for example, Henry David Thoreau, he didn't just go to the woods to escape life. He went there to observe it, to strip away distraction, to notice what remained. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, wasn't interested in the dogma, in the whole thing. He wasn't doing it just because of a trend. He was interested in precipitation, the perception of the whole thing, and how seeing it changes of how you live. These thinkers weren't rejecting society. They were trying to recover clarity. Now, it's so important to as truth seekers, to see, in clarity and to see it for what it is. But before we go through, before we get in this deeper, before we read, discuss, and reflect, something important has to be understood. Observation begins at home, in your own body, in your own habits, in your own daily rhythms. You don't need to go out into a cabin in the woods to observe. You need just attention. Now, most people don't fail because they lack knowledge. They fail because they stop noticing. They ignore fatigue. They normalize tension. They explain away discomfort until the body has to speak so loud that sometimes it just crashes. Now, observation keeps the conversation quiet. It allows course correction early. It replaces panic with understanding. Now, panic is another emotional issue that can cause a lot of problems, and it there itself is a distraction. Now, this episode isn't asking you to change anything immediately. It's asking you to watch, to notice, to slow down in your own life just enough to see what's already happening. In the next episodes, we will evolve. We will continue. We'll begin integrating older perspectives more directly. We'll talk about nature as a teacher would, and about simplicity as clarity, not deprivation, about how earlier generations learned through attention rather than instruction. Now, but none of that matters if observation is missing. If we talk about everything, pull up all the encyclopedias in the world, but if you don't observe, if that's missing, because without observation, wisdom becomes just theory. And this series isn't about theory, it's about living better, quietly, steadily, and with dignity. If there's one thing to take from this episode, it's this: nothing meaningful changes until something is noticed, and nothing is noticed without attention. Attention and observation. Now, listen, I really appreciate you staying with me, and we'll continue on this path together in the next episode. And like I said, I appreciate it. End of the vlog. Thanks. Now,